Hey, what is going on, Wildlife X team? This is Michael here, and in today's video we're going to be talking about how evolution works, how it affects DNA, and how it affects the whole world and wildlife and different organisms in the world. So DNA is basically what makes up all of our body. It kind of is the blueprint, if you will, of how our body is going to come and be made. Every single animal and pretty much every living creature in the world has this DNA inside of them. And so when you're being made in your mother's womb and you're just you're starting to turn into a baby, this DNA is kind of like the code, if you will. Like, you know, if you code a computer to do a certain thing, the DNA codes the life inside of us to tell us this is how we're going to be made, this is how we're going to grow, this is how we're going to look. It's going to, you know, your DNA is going to determine if you have blue eyes, if you have brown eyes, what color skin you have, basically how tall you're being. Your DNA is going to decide everything. And so it's actually possible for DNA in an organism, when people reproduce, for it to randomly change for basically any reason at all whatsoever. And so this can be a very sudden change where it's a very noticeable difference in the offspring, or it can just be very, very subtle, almost not even detectable, and it can be just so very small that there are basically no noticeable changes, but this small change over several generations can create very different effects in the long term. When the DNA changes, it's actually called a mutation. So every time the DNA changes, it's basically mutating itself as life is trying to create new forms and best optimize each organism for its particular environment. So a mutation can be either beneficial, neutral, or harmful. If a mutation is beneficial, it means that the DNA is going to be better than what it was before, and that organism is going to be more likely to survive. It's going to have stronger attributes or stronger features, or maybe more attractive features, so it's going to be more likely to reproduce, and this better DNA, if you will, is going to be more likely to be passed down. A change could also be neutral, which means it has no effect at all whatsoever, and so while the DNA is changing, it didn't change enough for anything to really be changed. Also, a change in DNA can be harmful, in which it was just kind of like a mess up and the DNA is actually not helping the organism survive better. So organisms with that harmful DNA are going to be less likely to survive in the wild, they're going to be less likely to reproduce, and so that negative DNA is going to be less likely to be passed on, whereas DNA with beneficial changes is going to be more likely to be passed on through nature and wildlife. These mutations in DNA basically is what scientists believe to have created all living organisms. It's believed that we all basically just came from bacteria, and then the bacteria slowly mutated, it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and basically we all kind of came from one blob, but the DNA was just getting spread all over the place, and so that's basically how scientists believe all of the wildlife have came to be. This is also why our wildlife on Earth is very diverse, is because literally one bird now in 1,000,000 years could create 5 different species, and that species that it was initially could be completely dead. This is also why when we have something such as the Great Meteor that wiped out all of the dinosaurs, we had a few living rodents that were able to survive, and they were able to mutate and again create this abundant life on Earth. It's because only a few living organisms need to survive any particular disaster or event, and then they're going to keep surviving, they're going to keep going, but as they spread all around the Earth, their DNA is going to mutate, new organisms are going to come up, and it's just going to continue spreading and spreading and spreading until we have ecosystems and a very diverse wildlife on Earth. This process of evolution basically guarantees that life for the most part is not going to die off. It's actually been shown that bacteria is even able to survive in outer space. So if you were to put outer space on the outside of a spaceship, it would still be able to survive, and so when that bacteria comes back to Earth, it's still going to be living. And so basically this process guarantees that even the smallest of bacteria will eventually be able to create life. And this is also why scientists believe that there might be life on other planets or under a moon in water or something like that, because life is always evolving, and so bacteria is basically going to mutate into whatever is most likely to survive in a particular environment. This process, by the way, is called natural selection, in which animals or creatures with better DNA are more likely to survive than creatures with a less strong DNA. So if you For example, if you were to burn up in the sun every time you were to walk in the sun, it would be very unlikely that that organism would survive, because we're obviously going to have the sun. Basically 50% of the whole year is going to be in sunlight. So if there was an organism that was not able to survive in direct sunlight, it would be very unlikely that this creature would be able to reproduce. And so that's why an organism like that probably doesn't exist. We humans lived and we have reproduced, for example, because we have a brain, we have fingers, we're able to create tools and do things. And so because we're so intelligent and able to adapt, on top of our DNA, which has made us very resistant to changes in climate, or we can climb, we can walk. That's basically why we've been able to reproduce. And so that's called natural selection again, where creatures with better DNA are more likely to survive in the wild, in nature, or whatever ecosystem they're in. For example, even on Earth, we have deserts and rainforests, and if you were to take a rainforest animal and place it in the desert, it would not be that likely to survive. And same for an animal in the desert, putting it in the rainforest, it would also not likely survive. So basically, with natural selection, creatures that are more likely to survive in a certain environment are more likely to reproduce. Because they're more likely to reproduce, their DNA is going to get passed on, and it's going to continue mutating. And the negative DNA, so if there's a harmful change in the DNA, that creature is going to be less likely to reproduce, but creatures with better DNA are going to be more likely to reproduce. And so those creatures are going to be more likely to survive in an ecosystem, and this is why we have certain creatures which are well adapted for a desert, but not well adapted for an ocean. One more thing about evolution and mutations and whatnot. Bacteria actually reproduce asexually, which means you have one little piece of bacteria and then it splits itself into two. So it only needs itself. It doesn't need any other bacteria or any other creatures for it to reproduce. Whereas humans and animals and mammals and tons of wildlife on Earth reproduce sexually, which means it needs a male and a female partner. So the male and the female, they come together, and this is also just speeding up that process of mutating DNA and creating potentially new harmful or beneficial adaptations in the DNA, is because with one bacteria, when it splits, it can only have so many possible mutations. But when you have two creatures, a male and a female, they probably already have different DNA. It's not like one male is going to have the exact same DNA as the female, so they're going to come together, and even without mutations, they're going to create new combinations of DNA, which is going to be more or less likely to survive in the wild. And if it's more likely to survive, then it's more likely to continue reproducing that DNA attributes which made that creature more likely to survive is more likely to exist. So not only does DNA just mutate on its own if a creature is reproducing asexually, but it also does it sexually, where it's combining different DNA and then just randomly mutating as well. Again, this is basically how wildlife has survived on the Earth. This is why life will probably always exist. Now, if there's like a huge thing that happens on the Earth, of course wildlife will go away. But this is why wildlife has been extremely resistant to changes in climate, changes like with a natural disaster wiping out all the dinosaurs. There were still some creatures that were able to survive that, and because they were able to survive that, they just reproduced again, and then the DNA just continued mutating until it created abundant ecosystems again. So that's basically how evolution works, and how DNA gets passed on, and how mutations are actually beneficial overall, generally speaking. Is because we are always evolving. Nothing is constant in life. Every different offspring is slightly evolved. Now, it takes millions upon millions of years for gradual or for big noticeable changes to be seen, unless it's like a crazy mutation. So this is a very subtle process, and it takes a very long time, thousands, hundreds of thousands of years before changes are going to be seen. So in the short term, nothing crazy is going to be done, and any species is not going to be put at risk. But in the long term, those with better DNA are going to be more likely to reproduce, and so that DNA is going to get passed on, and so life is always improving itself. We hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you guys have any question on evolution, leave it in the comment section below and we'll do our best to answer it. Make sure to leave a thumbs up if you found this video entertaining or informative. My name is Michael with Wildlife X Team. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.